Forza Horizon has a festival problem, but so does every other modern open-world racing game. But before I go any further, I do want to go ahead and break that statement down so I can better articulate what I mean and where I'm coming from. My very first Forza game was Forza Motorsport 2, and following Forza Motorsport 2, I played every other Forza Motorsport game until the release of the first Horizon, and then I proceeded to basically binge play Horizon for the majority of that part of my life. And that's not to say that Horizon 1 was the first game to ever approach the festival style of gameplay presentation. However, it was definitely the first one to do that kind of presentation on the level that it did. And we've seen the sort of tone shift in a lot of the years following the continual success of the Forza Horizon games, where more and more franchises have adopted a racing festival as their sort of, I don't even know if you would call it an undertone or an overtone at this point. Honestly, probably a thematic overtone. Because again, so many racing games in this day and age center around the idea of partaking in a massive festival, which there's nothing wrong with whatsoever. But while there is nothing inherently wrong with a festival theme in a racing game, I do think it's had some very interesting consequences in regards to the racing game landscape. And this brings me to my first of several topics that I want to talk about. And one of the first ones is player burnout and overall frustration. And specifically, player frustration with newer games sooner and sooner after their release, especially games like the Crew Motorfest. Now, there are obviously several things that the Crew Motorfest could have done a little bit better in terms of retaining its player base, but I think what I'm about to talk about goes far beyond the Crew Motorfest and several other games not having the greatest retention. Mind you, this is not to say that Horizon's numbers are not doing very, very well still. And as a matter of fact, as of recording this video, both Forza Horizon 5 as well as 4 are doing incredibly well on the Steam charts, and that's just one small part of the community, which is the PC player base on Steam, and that doesn't account for the numbers that exist through the Xbox app on PC either. I mean, just for Forza Horizon 5 in the past 30 days alone, it has seen an increase of over 14%. And let's not talk about Forza Motorsport, because Forza Motorsport is not doing too hot. Forza Motorsport is honestly not doing too hot on any front. It's taking heavy hits in terms of player base, but it's also taking heavy hits in terms of the community, and just the overall, I think, opinion towards the game has just continued to get worse. And that's of course not for no reason. I mean, Forza Motorsport certainly has a good amount of issues that definitely need fixing, and I personally have my own frustrations with Forza Motorsport, but this video is not about motorsport. We'll talk about that another day. But rather what this video is really about is, it's about me expressing my own personal frustrations with, honestly, the fact that as more open world racing games come out, you can pretty much predict that they will follow that same open world festival structure that has been around since Horizon 1 in some way, shape, or form. And yes, I am well aware of the fact that a festival is logistically a good thing to base a racing game off of. It gives you a good set of building blocks, but it's not the only set of building blocks available. And that's not to say I'm just nostalgic for older racing games. I mean, if I was solely nostalgic for older racing games, like a lot of people are in honestly just about everybody's comment sections these days, I would just be posting the same copy-paste, I don't know, remaster Need for Speed Most Wanted 05 or else. Because there were other games that were doing the festival thing and had a very festival-focused vibe, even back then, even in the Need for Speed series. Like, for example, we had Pro Street, which was entirely centered around a festival environment. And honestly, I think Pro Street did a fairly decent job of that. But I think at the same time, when you go back and look at Pro Street now, there are definitely elements of it that are certainly dated. And I mean, there's gonna be elements of any game that are going to be dated when you look back at it, 7, 8, 9, 10 years later, of course. But I think at the same time, it almost feels like the more that racing games continue to adopt a universal style of being based around the festival, it almost seems like it just feels like there are less elements of creativity, less elements of risk, and less elements of this, that, and the other that may be contributing factors to things like continued player frustration and higher player drop-off rates in some of the other games in this niche. And you always hear a lot of different suggestions from a lot of different people. Like, for example, the people that sort of almost idolize that Most Wanted 05 era of racing games and put those games up on a pedestal, you'll always hear them talking about how racing games are not gritty enough. They're not gritty enough anymore. They don't have enough of that gritty feel and tone and vibe. But if you go back and watch a lot of the gameplay and the cutscenes and listen to the dialogue from, say, for example, Most Wanted 05 today, a lot of it seems so incredibly cheesy that it's like endearing in a different way than it was maybe when you first played it. And while I certainly don't think that we're going to see that exact style come back in really any game, I do think it would be cool to see elements of stuff like that re-enter the artistic style of some future games. Because the beauty of that era of Need for Speed was that it didn't take itself too seriously. And I almost think that a lot of people didn't realize that it wasn't taking itself super seriously. And then you ended up with this subculture of people that thought that was super serious, like that style was this ultra serious stylistic decision, which then creates kind of an awkward in-between, because you have people that think that was super serious and they want that back as like a core pillar of racing games. But then again, they don't necessarily realize that style was the game not taking itself super seriously. And as people have almost demanded that racing games become more and more quote-unquote serious over the years, you end up with a landscape of festival-based, open-world racing games with very simcade-influenced physics to give players at least somewhat of an inkling that the physics are just realistic enough to be taken seriously. I say seriously in air quotes, but just realistic enough to be taken seriously, but not necessarily so realistic that they become overly frustrating for new players. Because let's not forget, one of the biggest criticisms we see of just about every new arcade racer is that, you'll see comment sections everywhere in arcade racers fill up with, why would I ever play this? It's not realistic. And I think that games like Horizon are just realistic enough, or rather they give people the feeling that they are just realistic enough to sort of satisfy that element of commenter, that element of player that needs just enough realism to feel like they're doing something, to feel like they're engaging with something that is a little bit more than like, oh, something that's purely arcade is somehow, I don't know who came up with this vibe in terms of racing games, but it's honestly, it just goes back to that overwhelming opinion that so many people have, that if your game is not somewhat realistic, then it's only for quote-unquote children. And there are so many games that end up getting, again, walls and walls and walls of comments from people that if it doesn't have realism-derived or realism-based physics models, it ends up just getting spammed with people saying, oh, so it's a kid's game. And honestly, the biggest takeaway for me is that a game does not have to be so incredibly realism-inspired to be intended for an audience other than kids. Because games at the end of the day, whether they're based on racing or, I don't know, climbing up the side of a mountain or adventuring in dungeons or whatever the case may be, video games are something that you are engaging with to have fun. You're engaging with to relax. You're engaging with to enjoy a different world in a lot of cases. And I don't think that we should be necessarily so focused on hyperrealism, or rather being derived from hyperrealism. This is not a critique of people that enjoy sim racing, like full-on hardcore sim racing, because that, of course, has an extremely valid place. But rather, this is more a critique of how the demand for games, and racing games specifically, to be just realistic enough to not be classified as unrealistic or arcadey, right? That has kind of caused us to end up with this landscape of almost everything that is prominent being hyper festival inspired. And remember, these are all my opinions, of course. These are all opinions that, you might think these are all entirely incorrect and wrong, and that this entire topic was just entirely mindless, and you might just, go on with your day and go, wow, that was a really badly thought out video, also terribly put together. Or you may have enjoyed it, and if you did, share your opinions in the comments down below. And what I would like to end on is honestly my own personal opinion. And one of my own personal opinions about this whole thing is that the racing game community is so widely segmented and so widely separated that the community doesn't really have, it's like there's always going to be conflicting opinions on what makes a good racing game, and there's always going to be so many people that are going to hate on what a franchise does, no matter what they come out with. I feel like that's also part of it, or at least it could be part of the reason why we end up with titles that try to offer absolutely everything, because a title that tries to offer as many different options as possible probably carries less risk in the grand scheme of things, because when you offer as many different aspects of gameplay as Horizon does, it's like you can't necessarily specialize in any of them, but you can offer a massively wide range that a lot of different people are going to try, and so it ends up being a lot safer of an option for a developer, which I can totally understand. But at the same time, I think there is definitely a certain aspect of creativity and risk that ends up being lost as well. So that is where I'm going to end this one. And if y'all have any other opinions to add, let me know in those comments down below.